Lesson 29. The Hinayana, the Buddhism of the small vehicle from kuon ganjo, passed without beginning. Until the 1st century BCE, the Hinayana was the only Buddhist doctrine. Since the Mahayana emerged, Hinayana today is losing ground facing the doctrine of the great vehicle. It is so marginalized that it remains in only a few Southeast Asian countries. Remaining fundamentally anti-hokke-nehan, the period when the Lotus Sutra and Nirvana were taught, Hinayana has never been able to arouse in its adepts a spirit of inquiry that would have enabled it to realize the Buddha's wish expressed in the Jigage section of chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra to democratize the attainment of Buddhahood. To better understand the philosophy of the Hinayana, after having defined it briefly, it will be necessary to go back to the almost half-century of the Buddha's teaching. Summarized meaning of Hinayana. The Hinayana is a teaching whose essence lies in attaining the stage of arahat, sage who has freed himself from illusions. Pejoratively called a small vehicle on the grounds that its followers are only concerned with their personal development without concern for the salvation of others. The Hinayana has as its basic doctrine the Four Noble Truths and the 12-link chain of causality. According to this doctrine, we know, earthly desires are at the origin of our suffering. Thus, the eradication of suffering would imply the elimination of earthly desires. The indispensable return to the Buddha's Dharma and examination of the Buddha's Dharma over the past half-century shows that the Hinayana is no more important than the Mahayana in terms of time periods. Of the lowered position of the Hinayana in the Tendaic periodic classification of the Buddha's Dharma. In the Tendaic periodic classification of the Buddha's teachings, only 2 periods are devoted to the Hinayana. These are the periods of the Garland of Flowers, teachings following the Buddha's enlightenment, or Kigen and Agama period or Agama Sutra period. The Hinayana, as we can see, is reduced to the bare minimum. It concerns only 2 out of 3 periods. This marginality of the Hinayana is still noticeable when a classification of the 3 most important sutras of the Buddha is made. In the teachings of the Daishonin, Tiante and many other great sages, the Lotus and Nirvana Sutras precede the Flower Garland Sutra. Of the predominance of the Hinayana after the Buddha's exposition of the Hokke-nehan Dharma, the Hinayana should have been abandoned. No way. The Buddha's successors continued to put the Hinayana above the Mahayana. This lasted until the 2nd century. If the Hinayana flourished up to this period, in flagrant contradiction to the Buddha's intention to democratize immediate and immediately Buddhahood attainment, it was because the time had not yet arrived and the people qualified to do the job had not yet appeared. Several centuries after the Buddha's death, Nagarjuna appeared in India, who established the early Mahayana. In the 6th century, the great master Tiante appeared in China, who strengthened the foundations of the Mahayana by moving it from the primitive stage to the provisional Mahayana stage. In the 13th century, Nichiren Daishonin brought about the final transformation of the Mahayana. Ultimately, the Hinayana appears as an expedient means to the Mahayana, not a doctrine destined for any kind of sustainability. The history of the Hinayana through its schools or currents. The geographical and doctrinal incoherence of the Buddhist world officially led to the splitting of Buddhism into 2 groups, Mahansangika, Sthaviratam in 386 during the First Buddhist Council of Rajagriha. The Mahansangika, the Great Assembly, its principal concern, the holiness of the arahat, the sage freed from the cycle of births. The Mahansangika considers the Buddha as a being transcending the contingencies of our world while enclosing the historical Buddha in a magical apparition in a demonstrative perspective of enlightenment. The Mahansangika, the elders, this more conservative, more rigorous tendency militants rather in favor of the holiness of the arahat. About 250 AD, during the reign of the Emperor Maurya, Ashoka, at Pataliputra, the capital of the Sid Empire, during the Second Buddhist Council, this current split into 3 groups, Vibhajyavadim, which gave birth to Theravada in Sri Lanka, Samatya, and Sarvastidam. Vibhajyavadim. The depictions of the Vibhajyavadim portray the historical Buddha as a mere mortal who attained supreme enlightenment, the arahat as an unassailable being, and all phenomena as conditioned except nirvana. Sarvastidam. Rather realistic, the Sarvastidam profess the ultimate constitution by material phenomena. They willingly integrate the theory of the world of the 3 planes. Their keen sense of erudition and rigor led them to draw up a meticulous inventory of doctrinal elements. Sometimes, however, bitten by the cherry squirrel virus, they end up making the teaching of the historical Buddha difficult to understand. The Samadhiya they are called personalists, all the more so because they are obsessed with the perpetuation of the individual being. This is because they cling to the concept of a person, Pudgala, who collects existences without being confused with an eternal soul.